This podcast is brought to you by the Maryland State Library Agency. The MSLA podcast features presenters from statewide youth programs, as well as learning opportunities for library staff and resources for patrons of the Maryland State Library for the Blind and Print Disabled.
Hello, and welcome to the MSLA Guest Hour. I'm Communications Manager Tim Pratt, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Maryland State Library Board Chair Kristen Pironis, who has served on the board since 2022. Kristen also serves as Executive Director of Visit Annapolis in Anne Arundel County and as a member of the Anne Arundel County Local Workforce Development Board. Kristen, thank you for joining me today.
Happy to be here.
So before we get started, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your professional background?
Sure. I'm going to start way back, right? So I always knew I was going to be an artist, of course. And I was in high school and I was going to be either a photographer or I was going to do ceramics. And then my parents questioned that because that was kind of a risky career move. And so I went into the very lucrative field, as you know well, journalism. That definitely was pretty interesting. When I graduated with a journalism degree, I knew it was really helpful for my career and that I could communicate well with people. And I could get people comfortable, get people talking with me. And that has served me really well. Interestingly, I didn't get into the library service for quite some time, even though as a child, I was very much about libraries. And I'll tell you more about that, I know, later. But my current position, as you mentioned, is Executive Director of Visit Annapolis in Anne Arundel County. I came into this role during the pandemic. Very wise career choice to go into hospitality and tourism during a pandemic when virtually everything was shut down. But it was such an opportunity to go into an industry that was reinventing itself. And I had been at my previous position, which I loved, at the Naval Academy for 16 years. And this opportunity, the more I talked to the people, the staff, the board, I knew it was the right thing at the right time. And I've been here 3 years and I've loved every moment of it.
Yeah, so can you talk a little bit about what the organization does?
Sure. Again, we are as an industry reinventing ourselves. We are charged with our mission. Our reason for being is really to promote tourism to Annapolis and Anne Arundel County. And interesting, when I interviewed for it, I didn't really understand the similarities between what I do here and what libraries do. It's free access to information. It's helping people where they are at that time and getting them what they need. I mean, even with we have volunteers that run our visitor center in Annapolis, and they get the craziest calls, like, where's the closest fabric store? And I know that librarians get those calls too. So it just really was kind of neat to see those similarities. But it's not just about getting people to Annapolis and Anne Arundel County. We believe and we know that it's really important for us to have a great destination. So we really focus on managing the destination, making sure we have great quality of life for the residents. And then we know when we entice visitors to come, they're going to have a great experience. So it really is that whole continuum. And it's been just fascinating seeing the industry come back to life and just what that means for the people that live here, but also the people who visit here.
Very good, very good. And now moving on to more library-specific questions. So for people who aren't familiar, can you talk a little bit about the Maryland State Library Board? What does the board do, and what are some of its duties and responsibilities?
That's interesting. I didn't know a lot about it 2 years ago, other than the people that were involved. So the last 2 years has been really a learning experience. Prior to that, it had been a smaller organization within a larger agency. In the past 6 years, it's been its own agency. And I think that's been what's been exciting in this role as board chair is figuring out what that means for the agency. So I'd say the last 6 years and the two chairs prior to me, they needed to focus on policy and procedures and getting just the nuts and bolts right and getting the infrastructure right and getting, this payment has to go here. I mean, just basic business things. It was very much a startup. And so watching them sort of pull all of that together, now we're refining that, but I don't think we have to be as internally focused anymore. And I think that we'll be able to push out a little bit more as well. And that's why I'm on the board, because I really think it's important for people to understand what libraries across Maryland are about.
Yeah, very good. What attracted you to the board in the first place, and what have you learned about libraries since you joined the board?
So, great question. That's a hard question. I think that if you care about something and you're not willing to put your time in it, that says something about who you are, right? And so I didn't just jump right into the Maryland State Library Board. I was involved locally. I live in Queen Anne's County. I was involved in their board. I went in like once a week getting books, right? And so they needed more board members. My librarian said, you should do this. And I thought, that's silly. I don't need to be involved in that. I didn't know what we'd be doing. And it was terrific just getting to understand sort of what the budgets were, what the process was, what that meant to be a county department. Then I was asked to be on the Citizens for Maryland Library Board. Clearly, I don't know how to say no. So this is what happens. You get on one board, you get to know people, and somebody else asks you. And so I was lucky enough to chair both of those. And when Irene and Sharon Marshall approached me about being on the board for the state library and then being chair, I of course said yes, because those two experiences prior, I'd say got me really excited about what we could do at the state level.
Very good. And when you say Irene, we're talking about Maryland State Librarian Irene Padilla, who is set to retire at the end of this month.
You're
So,
exactly right.
what has it been like to work with her?
So Irene and I have known each other for now about 15 years. And when I first met her, and I'm so glad that I'm saying this on a very public podcast, but she scared me to death, right? I mean, everything that I knew about libraries could be like found on a page. And Irene knew everything about libraries, why they exist, all the policies, all of these things. And I was a library goer, right? Like I thought like happy go lucky, yay, libraries, books are good. And I already knew the business of it. And so I had the enthusiasm. I think I had that, and that was great. But Irene was such a good resource to me as I tried to navigate some local political things and as I got involved with Citizens for Maryland Libraries and understood advocacy a little bit more. She has always been a very good resource and was always able to answer a question when you needed just that guidance and that basic information that not being a librarian, I'm never going to have, but I've got it. I've got the enthusiasm, but not necessarily the degree and the governance side of things down.
Yeah. Was it a easy transition or was it challenging? Like, how would you describe the whole process?
So I think governance as a whole, my master's is in nonprofit governance, so that's helpful. So I get that, like how to call a meeting to order, those basics. But I think really understanding the ins and outs of libraries and the system and sort of the nuance between sort of a public library, which I was used to, versus an academic versus a school library, learning more about all the different resources. That was something that, unless you grew up in the system or unless you grew up understanding that and you are a librarian, I think it's really hard to get your head around how expansive it is. It's not just your local library down the street.
So, was that a surprise to you, or were there any major surprises since you've joined?
I think the surprise, and I don't know if it's a surprise, I think the neatest thing I got to understand was the library for the blind and print disabled. That was something that I haven't had a need for, but I will tell you that what I've learned being on the state library board, watching John Owen and his team, it's not just about providing services because they obviously they're going to do that. That it's in the name that they get their mission, but I think how innovative they are and how thoughtful they are in the decisions they make. I don't want to say it was a surprise. I should expect it, but it was something that I was unaware of. So it just made me really proud to be part of that. Even though I didn't do anything to be part of it, it just feels really good to represent that because what they're doing is really, I think, a model for providing services across the state.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one of the things that jumped out at me since I started working at MSLA was they're doing so much for the community that I had very little idea about, and it's been eye opening to say the least. So, and can you talk about a little bit about some of the board's priorities moving forward?
I think the biggest priority is transitioning in a new state librarian, right? I think that's going to be really interesting. I had a meeting with the board the other day, and what I said to them is we have this opportunity to sort of level set with the staff, with the state, with our elected officials, and with each other. And I asked them to join me in really setting that expectation high. I mean, one of the things, and I'm sure, Tim, you've heard it a lot, is Maryland is library heaven. And I think that is a very sweet thing to say. I'm not very sweet, by the way. So that's not necessarily a compliment because I feel like if you think it's library heaven, you might be complacent. You might not keep pushing forward. And I think that there's always so much progress to be made. And what John has done with the innovation with the library, that like those kind of things, we don't want to just say like library heaven, we're good enough. I think good enough is just such a tough thing to swallow as board chair, right? You want to push forward. When I will tell you, I've had opportunity over the search process to meet more of the staff, and the staff is incredible, right? And so let's make sure that the staff and the state librarian and the board, who are all pretty incredible people, are all working together. And so I'll say that's my commitment as chair that I'm not going to be complacent. I'm not going to let myself get bored or say it's good enough. So either the staff's going to love that or hate that, but that's what they get with me.
Very good. And you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but can you talk about your experience with public libraries before you joined the board? I mean, is this something that goes back to your childhood, or like, can you just talk about that history there?
Yeah, definitely. So my parents moved around a lot. My mother was a CPA and accountant. My dad was a pharmacist. So you wouldn't think that we'd move around a lot, but they loved to try new things. And so my brother and I were very good at picking up and moving and picking up and moving. And if you move a lot, you don't have a ton of books at home because they're really heavy boxes, right?
Right.
So every time we got to a new community, we go to the library first. I mean, we still had our boxes in our house. I mean, I have library cards. I have to show you the next time I see you the library card I have. But that was the first thing, and, like, once we had the library card, we knew we had a place in the community, we knew we had a home, we knew we could stock up on books again, it was one of those things that was really important to us, and I mean, it was clearly more important to my parents because 'cause they're the ones that drove us and took us there, but, like, my brother and I just knew it, and my brother and I are still really close. We don't live close together, but now I see it with his children and how they have gravitated to that. They're living in Singapore now, and they've got really great access to information in Singapore, but it just was really, I think, what symbolized community to me growing up. And I always felt like it didn't matter if I knew any kids, I'd meet them there and I'd have a place to read and get a book.
Very good. So what kind of books did you enjoy reading, and what are you reading now?
So, and that's pretty funny.
Or do you have time to read anything now?
I do. So I think everybody has time, right? You just lack priorities. If you say you don't have time, it means you didn't prioritize it. So I read a lot. I typically get a nonprofit. Oh, that's funny. Nonfiction and a fiction at the same time, and depending on how hard the day was, that's what I'll read. And right now, I'm reading, and I'm finishing because I've had it for a little while, so I'm a little embarrassed to say how long it's taken me to read it. But it's called Madness, and it's about Crownsville Hospital, and it's called Race and Insanity in a Jim Crow Asylum. And Anne Arundel County is really, I will say, at this point, really working head on with issues of racism and disparity in healthcare. And this book is really based on interviews from the nurses and patients at that asylum. And it's intense. It's not an easy read, which is why it's taken me a little bit longer to read, because you have to really put it down and think it through and feel it, and then sort of figure out what that means for you. And so I don't mean to be so heavy in this, but that it's a pretty intense book, and I recommend it. The other thing, I'm trying to write a book. So I'm spending some of my free time doing that. I took a week off over Memorial Day and wrote about 6,000 words, and
Oh,
only
wow.
about 70,000 more to go. But it's it's not going to be as interesting as the book I'm reading now. But it's really about change management and nonprofit organizations. So it's academically based. It will
Okay.
not have a wide appeal, I believe.
Well, don't sell yourself short. I know you got your own community out there, so
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, those governance nerds are absolutely gonna love this book.
Very good. So one of the things that also has jumped out at me is I mean, I grew up going to the library myself and kind of seeing that evolution from just books and card catalogs to the dawn of the internet. The first time I ever got on the internet was at the local library, and then just the way technology has changed and the way all the resources have changed. Have you seen that? And then in what ways do you take advantage of the resources that the libraries offer?
So right now I'm taking resources. They have an academic research way to get in, so you don't have to pay as much money to get some of the academic research I'm using for my book. But it's interesting because I know you were interested in talking a little bit about some of the challenges in libraries. And one challenge that I'd say the library doesn't have is how librarians and the staff have been able to adapt to all of those things, to getting computers, to understanding email, to then training people and bringing services to their communities. And I don't really know any other industry that does it as well. And I'd say then that flip side is making sure that the local community understands all of those services. And I think that's where we might fall a little bit short. And so that people are like, oh, I say that I'm on the library board. They're like, oh, you must read a lot. And I do read a lot, but that's not why I'm on the board. I'm on the board so that we make sure we have policies and funding and the priority. I'm on the board to make those things so that those librarians and the staff can then adapt as the community needs. And I think that the community, I'll say, understanding of libraries is lagging where libraries really are. And I think that that's one of the things that I would like us to really tackle, especially in Maryland, to make sure that people understand, yeah, it is about books on the shelves, and yeah, it is about access to internet. But the libraries have been changed to really provide more wraparound services and to really figure out what that all means. And so I think the place that libraries have in the community are very different than even when I grew up, because for me, it was really all about books. I mean, I didn't think the technology of the internet and email would catch on. I mean, I was totally wrong on that. Like nobody's going to have those impersonal things. But it's really, I think the library connects those impersonal things with a very personal service.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with you there. So, I mean, you kind of just touched on it, but how do you see the role of public libraries in Maryland communities? Yeah, I'll just stop there and let you answer.
I mean, I would say, gosh, I mean, I can't even guess, right? You sit there and you try and predict the future. I don't think any of us could have thought that the libraries would have adapted during COVID the way they did. I mean, I was like, oh, this sucks. I can't get any books anymore. And then they did, the drop off service at the front where, contactless service, and they were able to still provide things online. And so I would like to say that I can see the future and I'm so sure of where library is going, but I think I don't. But I think that the librarians in the state, certainly with public libraries, but also with school libraries, academic libraries, they know what they need. And I don't think it's the role of the state library board to tell them what they need. I think it's our role to make sure that they have the resources and the people and the support to provide those services. So I feel like in some ways, while we have to lead at a state level, we can't prescribe what the solutions would be in a particular community. And I think that can be a challenge, right, for the state because you can't be all things to all people, but you also can't tell people what to do in their local community. So I think the services at Enoch Pratt are going to be really different than what I have in Queen Anne's County, and I think that's okay. And I think that at a statewide level, that's what we have to understand and expect.
Yeah. And do you see a correlation between the health and the strength of our libraries and the success of local residents? I mean, you touched on Maryland being library heaven. And I mean, I was at the Glen Burnie Library last week and it's packed. Everybody's on computers, people are reading books, people are just there. So, I mean, I'm curious, like, how you see, if you see a correlation between libraries and the success of Marylanders.
I do. And in fact, it's interesting because Westmore, our governor, says that Maryland is asset rich and strategy poor. And I think that that can be a frustrating thing to hear, but then when you start to dig into it, you can kind of see that. And I think our library system being that asset rich, right? And to make sure that we can connect that at a state level to the residents. I think what makes libraries really special is it meets people where they are. There's not an assumption about you have to dress a certain way, act a certain way, get there a certain way. You don't have to be in the nicest car. You could walk there, you could bike there. I mean, it's just, I think that people at their basic core are comfortable and they trust libraries and librarians. And so they make that part of the community. And when that strength is there, then our communities are strong and the state is strong. And so I think the only disconnect we might have right now in that system being such a big asset to the state is to make sure they're funded appropriately and people understand what the funding is going toward. There's a lot of misinformation out there. I remember we were celebrating Library Day in Annapolis, and a delegate who will remain nameless, he's quite nice, but his first thing he said to me was, I was all for libraries until they took away fines.
Mm.
And I was like, wow, do you understand how little money some of those fines can bring? And you're penalizing those that are most vulnerable. And we got into it a little bit, and it wasn't the time or the place. And we've since had the conversation, but it's those little things that pop up that are assumptions either made by our local community or by our elected officials that we had to really address them sort of head on, unapologetically. Nope, this is what we stand for. This is not what we stand for. And I guess for me, that's probably the most important thing that the state library board and the state librarian, frankly, does is to make sure that we can provide those resources and those answers for people who are hearing those pop-up questions and concerns locally.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I think there's a misunderstanding, even when I first started, that the state, Maryland State Library Agency, we're in charge of every library in the state. But no, it's a county partnership. It's each library system. Can you just talk about the structure of our library systems for people who aren't super familiar?
Yeah, so Irene's probably better at this than me, right? So, I'll connect it to the structure of the library board because I think that that's what's really important. Is the library board is we have different perspectives. We come from different places. We come from different libraries, or we're citizens, but we come together to talk about those policies and those procedures and that resource that we can be across the state to address all those different kinds of libraries. Because your team, Tim, at the Maryland State Library can't provide that level of services across the state. You would have to be ginormous. So I think the decentralized approach works for our state, and it it takes the strength of the state, but also then the strength of the local communities and those relationships. Because this particular delegate that said this to me, I don't really have to worry about him day to day, right? But the person in that county needed to understand that that question came up. And so he or she could deal with that more appropriately at a local level. So I just think that I don't think I should probably get into the structure too much because I will mess it up and then you'll have to go back and edit. But I think what I like about the structure of the board is it recognizes and reflects the structure of the state library system. And I think that that's really important. So we have all those differing viewpoints as we sit around the table and have our thoughts about what should be next.
Yeah, very good. And speaking of Annapolis, did you want to talk about any of the General Assembly session? I know there was some high profile bills and some lesser high profile bills. Do you want to speak to any of those?
I mean, I think the one that I'd want to speak to the most and I've had the most conversation about is the Freedom to Read Act. And it's one of I'm so proud of what everybody did to make that happen. And Tim, I know you had a role in that very much behind the scenes, but you helped all of us out tremendously. And I appreciate that. I think what's so stunning to me about that bill is not that it passed, but that we had to have it at all. And I think that that's what was a little bit disappointing to me. And that goes back to the assumptions. All these people assume that you're going to have access to information. You're going to be able to do this. The librarians are going to be safe and secure in their roles, whatever school or county that they're in. And the fact that we had to react in that way as a library community says a lot about the work we need to do, that people have to understand what libraries are about. And so, yes, I'm super proud it happened. It was the right thing to do. We have lots of plans for how to sort of roll out next steps with that. But the fact that we even had challenges to some of the books, challenges to some of the librarians, it's a huge disappointment in this place that we call library heaven. I mean, that's just such a shame.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you talk about some of the challenges librarians and libraries face that kind of, prompted this legislation or some of the issues they were facing?
I don't know that I'm the best person to talk about it, but anecdotally, I mean, I can tell you that there were book challenges at schools in counties to specific librarians and what they were doing. I dealt with, when I was at Queen Anne's County, a challenge to a program that the library wanted to put on. And that's honestly, it was such an area that I was so unfamiliar with that Irene, current state librarian, was able sort of to help me navigate because it got to the point where, and this is such a wrong place to be politically, it was the library against the school with funding. And that should
Mhm.
never be. These two things don't have to be at odds. They need to work together. And it was a lot easier for some local folks to make one institution a bad guy and one the good guy. And there's this fight. And really, all we had to do was have a conversation. One of the neatest things about that terrible scenario, and I'm not getting into great detail, was we had to go to a county meeting. And it was an auditorium, and we all get up and we had 2 minutes to speak. And at the end of it, every single one of our county commissioners said, the library folks can come back anytime. They were the most respectful, thoughtful. They might not have agreed with anything we said, but we did so nicely and kindly, and we were righteous in what we did. And it started a conversation that we needed to have in our local community. And now some of those same commissioners are the biggest supporters of libraries, and I see them all the time.
Wow. And I feel like your professional background has kind of helped you bridge that gap. Like you know how to compromise or at least work with folks. Has your, full-time job influenced or helped you in your role as chair of the board?
Funny, I think it goes both ways, right? I think some of the advocacy I had to do through library work has helped me in my current role that I wasn't familiar with doing it for a paid position. And the opposite is true. I think one of the things that libraries really stand for is having, discourse, right? That you can disagree without being disagreeable. And I think that that's the most important thing. I mean, none of these issues that we're talking about are so personal, right? They can be. But if you take it at face value and you think about what's right for your community and what's right for you and what's right for the state, it becomes a lot easier. And if people they just stop the maybe loudness or the uncompromising part, they'll start to hear each other and they'll probably both be better for it. And so I think that diversity of perspectives is something that we have at a board level. We certainly have at a state level. And it's something that I think the state board and the state library has to make sure that we ensure that so that we're really exploring all the different sides of the issue. I think it's very easy to say, well, this is right, this is wrong. But you know what? We can all get better if we hear the opposite side. No, if we really listen to the opposite side.
Yeah, I agree. And getting close to wrapping up here, you mentioned earlier Irene Padilla is on her way out. She's retiring after a long and successful career. And our new state librarian is going to be Morgan Miller, who is going to be joining us from Cecil County. Can you talk a little bit about your workings with her over the years and what you're looking forward to with the next state librarian?
I mean, change for an organization like the Maryland State Library is, I think, always good, right? It's not going to be perfect. We're not going to be the perfect board. She's not going to be the perfect state librarian. Staff isn't going to be the perfect state staff. But I think together, because of who she is and the staff that's there now and the way that the board is going, it's a really special time, right? So I think you're right. I think the first thing to say is Irene has had an incredible career and has moved the agency forward in so many ways. I like to think of it as she really set the foundation along with the two chairs prior to me in the state agency. But now we have the opportunity to really, I'll say, continue to innovate, continue to push forward, and not be complacent with the idea of library heaven. I don't know Morgan well. I was, of course, part of the search that hired her, and I'm very proud of that hire. I look forward to getting to know her more, but her reputation is quite good. She has a lot of familiarity with managing staff, budgets, and working with boards. And those are things that are going to be really important because if you get one of those wrong, nothing else is going to work. And so I have a lot of confidence in her, a lot of confidence in the staff. And as a board, we just need to make sure that we're setting the right guidance and the right tone so that that leadership there reflects everything that the state library agency does.
And is there any message that you want to deliver to any librarians out there who might be listening? I'm putting you on the spot
Yeah.
on that one.
So I won't tell librarians how to do their jobs because I believe they know how to do that. But what I would ask them to do is to involve their local communities. Just like my local library in Queen Anne's County, like, hey, why don't you get on this board? And I didn't know what to expect. And it was one of the first boards I served on. I think the more the community understands what libraries do and don't just go to comfortable places to get to know potential folks in the community, go to the uncomfortable places, have the conversations. And I think the more that local communities understand what their local library does, and especially at a county level, the better off we're all going to be. And so I'd be happy. I'll say, if you want to meet anybody and you'd like me to come with you, I'll go with you across the state. We'll figure it out. I'm sure Morgan would make the same invitation. I just think it's really important for us at a state level to support the county level and for the county just to make sure that their citizens and their elected officials know what they do and know the service that they provide.
That's fantastic. Is there anything else you want to add about the board or libraries in general or MSLA or anything else we didn't touch on today?
I mean, it kind of goes along the same lines as I wouldn't want for anybody to take our situation in Maryland or how we're working right now and assume that it's going to stay that way. It was disheartening to see some of the things and some of the legislation that we had to talk about this year. And so I think that if we make some assumptions and we assume that we're not at risk in Maryland, we're going to go backwards. And so I think that we just need to make sure that we, again, communicate well what we're doing, understand the challenges, and come together to support one another. I think that's the biggest thing is I wouldn't want anyone to assume that things are going to stay the way they are.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kristen. This has been great. And just wrapping up, I'm here with Kristen Pironis, chair of the Maryland State Library Board for the MSLA Guest Hour. So thank you again.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Maryland State Library Agency. For links to additional resources provided by today's presenter, please visit the show notes. For more information on MSLA or the Maryland State Library for the Blind and Print Disabled, visit marylandlibraries.org.